Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a really fascinating journey through a collection of sources that shed light on some critical socioeconomic and ecological landscapes in India. It's really about understanding some deep, complex challenges, uncovering the sort of hidden forces at play, and maybe surprisingly, discovering some promising paths forward for the nation.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these topics that seem quite separate, welfare programs, urban living, ancient pastoral traditions, even modern trade, they actually connect.
Right.
They really paint a comprehensive, sometimes unexpected picture of India's whole development story. Our mission today really is to pull out the crucial nuggets of insight, explore why these issues matter so much, and what they mean for the future. Especially for you, our listener, trying to find clarity in, well, a lot of information out there.
Exactly. We'll be looking at everything from, say, the effectiveness or often the lack of it of government funding meant for marginalized communities to the surprising realities of urban poverty inside India's booming cities.
Uh-huh.
Then we'll get into the often overlooked struggles, but also the profound ecological wisdom of India's pastoralists.
Which is a fascinating area.
It really is. And finally, we'll explore the promising, maybe even transformative future of regional trade integration in South and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So let's start by unpacking the complex world of these welfare programs. Okay, so our first deep dive focuses on two absolutely vital initiatives in India: the Scheduled Caste Subplan, the SCSP, and the Tribal Subplan, or TSP.
Right, crucial programs.
Yeah, established specifically to uplift and benefit India's scheduled castes and scheduled tribes communities, that have historically faced severe marginalization and systemic disadvantages. But here's the crucial twist. Despite their sort of noble intentions, our sources make it pretty clear that the full potential of these subplans hasn't really been realized, not even close, actually, since they started decades ago. Which really begs the question, what stopped these programs from hitting their goals?
It's a huge question, isn't it? Especially given how long they've been around. And what's particularly striking, I think, is that the core issues holding them back, well, they've been consistently pointed out by scholars, activists, advisory committees, advocacy groups, you name it, for years.
Right.
Yet they just persist. It's a stark testament, really, to these deep-seated systemic challenges that just keep eroding their impact.
Right.
We're not talking about new problems here. These are decades-old failures.
And when we talk about these chronic issues, our sources lay out a pretty clear and honestly quite disturbing picture. The first big hurdle: consistently inadequate budgetary allocations.
Yeah.
For our listener, what does inadequate really mean here? Are we talking like a small shortfall or something really significant?
Oh, it's definitely significant. To give you a sense of the scale, let's break down some numbers.
Yep.
For the scheduled caste subplan, the actual share of funds that went to schemes targeted specifically for them was remarkably low. Well, take 2015-16, for example. It was just 6.6% of the total allocations meant for them. Now, it did climb a bit, reaching 11.7% by 2021-22.
Okay, an improvement, but
But still, that's miles away from what you'd expect based on their population share, which should be closer to, say, 16 or 17%.
right.
And the situation for the tribal subplan, pretty similar. We're talking 4.3% in 2015-16, rising to just 7.4% by 2021-22. When you think about the massive needs these plans are supposed to cover, education, health, livelihoods, these numbers show a fundamental, persistent underfunding that just cripples their reach from the get-go.
That's a stark figure right there. But it gets even more alarming, doesn't it? Beyond just not allocating enough, there's this massive problem of funds being diverted. Can you explain how that works and just how widespread it is?
Yeah, this is maybe one of the most frustrating parts. A really substantial chunk of the money that's explicitly earmarked for SC and ST schemes just gets, well, siphoned off and redirected to general non-targeted schemes.
Like what kind of things?
Oh, all sorts. Imagine money meant for, say, vocational training for tribal youth. But then a big piece of it ends up paying for general admin costs or maybe large infrastructure projects that don't directly benefit these communities disproportionately.
About roads or...
Yeah, or sometimes things completely unrelated. Our sources mention funds meant for SCST welfare being diverted to things like optical fiber networks for defense or general urban development projects not focused on these groups at all.
It's incredible. So how much money are we actually talking about being diverted here? Is it a small percentage or...
No, the figures are staggering. In 2015-16, an unbelievable 75.8% of SCSP allocations were diverted this way.
75%.
75.8. and 62.7% of TSP allocations. Now, there was a slight dip in some years, like SCSP diversion went down to about 51% in 2017-18.
Okay, slightly better.
But then it bounced right back up, tragically. By 2020-21, it was back to an alarming 80.6% for SCSP funds being diverted and 63.8% for TSP.
80%, so the vast majority of the money.
Exactly. The vast majority of money meant for India's most vulnerable groups just isn't reaching them as intended. It systematically undermines the entire purpose of these subplans.
That's truly disheartening. So, not enough money allocated, a huge chunk of that gets rerouted. What about the funds that do make it to the right place, the targeted schemes? Are they even being fully used?
Well, unfortunately, no. That brings us to what our sources call the budget credibility gap.
Okay.
It's this persistent difference between the approved budget, what's allocated on paper, and the actual expenditure, what gets spent on the ground. Almost every year, a portion of these allocations just remains unutilized.
So it just sits there.
It just sits there unspent. Now, there's been a slight improvement, maybe in utilization for scheduled tribe schemes recently, some progress there, but the gap remains really noticeable and persistent for scheduled caste schemes.
Can you put that in money terms? Does it
Yeah.
add up to a lot?
It really does. To give you some context that really hits home, the funds that failed to reach scheduled castes, just the unspent portion amounted to nearly 70,000 crore rupees in 2015-16 alone.
Wow.
And tragically, that figure ballooned to almost 90,000 crore rupees just 3 years later, by 2018-19. Imagine that scale of unmet need just piling up year after year. It's not just about allocations and diversions, but also about the basic capacity to actually spend the money effectively.
It sounds like a deeply entrenched, sort of multi-layered problem then.
Yeah.
Given these long-standing issues, have there been any real attempts to fix things? What's been done?
Oh, yes, there have been efforts, definitely. Though, their effectiveness is still a major point of debate. One big one was the Narendra Dutt Task Force.
Right, I remember that, 2010.
That's the one, set up by the old Planning Commission. Its job was basically to investigate how the funds were being used or not used and suggest fixes. And they were quite blunt. They pointed directly at the systemic failure of both central and state government ministries in implementing these subplans properly. They even categorized ministries, 68 of them, into 4 groups based on how much they should be earmarking for SCs and STs. Like, Category 4 ministries, the ones with the biggest obligation, were supposed to earmark over 16% for SCs and over 8% for STs, focusing on specific things like primary sector jobs, higher education, skills, poverty reduction.
So, detailed guidelines, clear mandates. But did it actually lead to change on the ground? What did the sources say about the real impact?
Well, this is where the picture gets, frankly, pretty bleak. Despite these guidelines, despite new guidelines in 2018 that gave nodal ministries like social justice for SCs, tribal affairs for STs, a clear mandate to monitor budgets, check schemes, coordinate evaluations, assess utilization.
Right.
Despite all that, the sources state pretty clearly that these nodal ministries have largely failed to fulfill their responsibilities. The constant underperformance, the fund diversions, the unspent money. It all points to what the sources call a lackadaisical attitude.
Lackadaisical. That's quite a term.
It is. A lackadaisical attitude in actually designing and implementing targeted schemes. It highlights this critical, almost staggering gap between policy intent, at the top level, and the actual execution and accountability down in the ministries. It's not a secret. It's a widely recognized failure.
This really just shows the chasm between policy and reality for so many people. And the stark reality of poverty for these communities really drives that home, doesn't it? Can you give us a sense of the lived experience given these ongoing issues?
Yeah, the statistics paint a truly grim picture of just persistent deprivation. Poverty incidence among SCs and STs is way higher than for other groups. Back in 2011-12, rural poverty for SCs was 31.5%. For STs, 45.3%.
45%.
Yeah. Compare that to OBCs at 22.6% and others at 15.5%. Big difference. You see similar gaps in urban areas too, though maybe slightly less pronounced.
And more recent data?
More recently, the Multidimensional Poverty Index data, this is UNDP 2021, really underscores it. More than half of STs, that's maybe 65 million people, live in multidimensional poverty.
Yeah.
And they make up a sixth of all multidimensionally poor people in India. Similarly, a third of SCs, 33.3%, or 94 million people also live in multidimensional poverty. These aren't just numbers, They represent millions of lives where basic necessities, quality education, decent healthcare, they're still severely limited. And it links directly back to the failures of these well-intentioned, but let's face it, poorly implemented programs. It's the cycle of deprivation they were meant to break.
It's clear there's an urgent, almost desperate need for action. What are the concrete policy imperatives coming out of our sources? What needs to happen to bridge this gap?
Well, the main thing is to radically empower those nodal ministries. They need to be transformed from just sort of monitors into real watchdogs, guiding institutions with teeth.
Teeth meaning?
Meaning real authority, not just making recommendations, but actually compelling other ministries to design and fund suitable, genuinely targeted schemes, and crucially, accountability.
Penalty.
Exactly. Strong calls for actual penalties for ministries and departments that consistently fail to earmark funds or implement proper schemes. The sources even mention proposals in a couple of draft bills to give mandatory legal status to SCSP and TSP.
Making it law, basically.
Making it legally binding, moving beyond just suggestions or best practices. This shift from sort of encouragement to strict enforcement is seen as absolutely critical for any real change on the ground. Without it, this cycle of underfunding and diversion just looks set to continue.
So what's the core insight here for our listener from this first section? What should they really take away?
I think the deepest insight isn't just about the money, the underfunding or diversion. It's the stark realization that decades of policy, well-intentioned policy for India's most vulnerable, are being actively undermined by this pervasive, lackadaisical attitude at really high bureaucratic levels. It effectively turns noble intent into bureaucratic negligence, and that has tangible, devastating consequences for millions. For you, it's a powerful reminder that the best policy designs mean very little without rigorous oversight, strong accountability, and a genuine, unwavering commitment to actually implementing them.
Okay, so from those systemic challenges in welfare programs, let's pivot now to the rapidly changing landscape of India's cities. Indian cities are often hailed as, these vibrant economic engines, drivers of growth.
Definitely.
But they also grapple with immense, often hidden challenges, especially urban poverty. The sheer scale of India's urban population is just astounding. 483 million in 2021, projected to hit 814 million by 2050. That's one of the biggest, fastest urban growths globally.
Huge numbers.
And that kind of explosive growth demands colossal investment. Our sources cite a committee back in 2011 estimating nearly 40 lakh crore rupees needed over 20 years just for urban infrastructure. And with nearly a quarter of city populations living in poverty, their basic needs, affordable housing, basic services, secure jobs, are absolutely critical and often just not met.
Yeah, and what's really crucial here, I think, is understanding that the traditional ways we measure poverty, usually based on income, often miss the full picture in cities.
How so?
Well, our sources highlight that urban poverty goes way beyond just not having enough cash. It includes what's called multidimensional poverty.
Okay, explain that a bit.
It means looking at deprivations across multiple aspects of life at the same time: health, education, living standards. So, for instance, while NTI Aayog's 2023 index reported about 5% of urban households affected, which might sound low compared to rural areas, that number alone doesn't tell the whole story.
So it's more than just a number on a poverty line.
Absolutely. As several studies confirm, people living in urban slums face severe deprivations, poor health, limited education, terrible living conditions, and that's compounded by things like housing insecurity, always fearing eviction, very limited access to quality services like water or sanitation, and high vulnerability to shocks.
Shocks like?
Economic downturns, health crises like pandemics, even climate events like floods. They hit the urban poor hardest. There's even a big debate among experts, with some arguing that official urban poverty figures are massive underestimates, maybe closer to 40–60% because of how it's measured and potential underreporting.
40 to 60%, that's a huge difference.
It is. It suggests the problem is far more widespread and deep-rooted than official numbers might show, and that poverty reduction hasn't reached everyone evenly, leaving millions behind even as cities boom economically.
That's a critical distinction. Poverty isn't just income, it's the whole spectrum of deprivation. Now, to understand this better, our sources give us some really granular insights from a survey done on the ground in Telangana. Can you tell us about that study?
Yeah, this was a really detailed and insightful survey. They went into 4 cities in Telangana, Bangir, Siddipet, Warangal, and also the big metro, Hyderabad.
Okay.
Researchers collected data meticulously from nearly 500 households living in slums, focusing on a really broad range of information. They looked at physical infrastructure, water connections, sanitation, electricity, and social infrastructure, access to schools, healthcare facilities available to slum dwellers.
No.
They also gathered info on individual households, literacy levels, BPL status, what kind of work people did, even why they migrated to the city in the first place.
Right.
And crucially, they looked at land ownership. Did people have a formal title, a pata, or were they on encroached land? Which hugely impacts their security. And finally, they tried to assess the real impact of various government programs, microcredit, marriage assistance, health insurance, special loans for SCSDs to see if these initiatives actually made a difference on the ground.
So with all that detailed data, what did they find when they crunched the numbers? They used a statistical model, right? What were the key things that correlated positively with higher income for someone in a slum? What really moved the needle?
Right. They used an OLS model, ordinary least squares, and it revealed some very interesting, sometimes counterintuitive things. For example, just being male correlated with over 4,000 rupees higher monthly income.
Yeah.
More significantly, having a stable job, particularly being a government employee, had a massive positive impact. We're talking about 12,600 rupees higher monthly income. That's like 540% more than a casual laborer.
Wow, huge difference.
And if that government employee lived in the core city area, their income jumped even further, over 19,000 rupees higher. That's nearly 670% more than a casual laborer in the core city. Education also mattered. Having qualifications above graduation meant about 5,000 rupees more monthly.
And what about where you live or the type of house? Did location and housing make a difference?
Absolutely. The study clearly showed living in the core city, not the periphery, correlated with a significant income boost over 3,100 rupees a month. In fact, people in notified slums, the officially recognized ones, in the core city had about 130% higher average income than those outside. And casual laborers in the core earned over 125% more than those on the edges.
Interesting.
The type of house mattered too. Living in a permanent puka house correlated with about 1,500 rupees higher income. And critically, having a formal land title, a pata, was linked to around 1,200 rupees higher income. People in the core city with pata land earned about 7,600 rupees more, nearly 70% higher than those without. It really underscores that stability, formal rights, and being close to the economic heart of the city have a real, measurable impact on earnings.
That paints a clear picture of what helps. But on the flip side, what factors were linked to lower income in these slums, according to the study?
Conversely, the study found being illiterate correlated with about 800 rupees lower monthly income. And here's a curious finding, as you hinted earlier. Living in a notified slum, which you might think offers more security, actually correlated with almost 900 rupees lower income.
That seems backwards, doesn't it?
It does seem counterintuitive. It might point to a lack of job security even within these recognized areas, or maybe a concentration of specific low-wage informal jobs there. And finally, being a casual laborer, predictably, was consistently associated with about 800 rupees lower income compared to more stable employment. It just highlights that vulnerability of daily wage work.
This is really perplexing, though. You'd think better housing, a puka house, or being in an official slum would mean better prospects. But if the data suggests income doesn't always follow, what are the hidden forces here? Is it just a lag? Or are there deeper structural issues that housing alone just can't fix? It feels like a real paradox.
It absolutely is a paradox, and our sources dig into several critical reasons why this happens. Firstly, even if people live in better houses, many remain stuck in unstable, informal jobs.
Like daily wage stuff.
Exactly. Daily wage labor, street vending, construction work. These jobs have huge income swings, often very low pay, and zero job security or benefits. Studies consistently show that just improving the house doesn't automatically lead to economic mobility if the underlying job market is deeply insecure and informal, which, remember, is over 80% of India's workforce.
So it's about the job quality, not just the roof. What else adds to this paradox?
Location, again, plays a huge role, but in a negative way sometimes. Those pucka houses built on the city edges, while physically better, they often lack good infrastructure, especially reliable public transport.
Right.
This means high commuting costs time and money, which effectively isolates residents from better-paying jobs that are usually in the city center. It eats into their net income and productivity.
Are there deeper social factors involved too, beyond just economics or location?
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, caste and broader social exclusion are still major factors. Marginalized communities often face systemic barriers, deep-seated discrimination in both job markets and housing markets. So even with better housing or some welfare benefits, these entrenched prejudices can stop them from fully grabbing opportunities. Research consistently shows how this exclusion severely limits economic mobility, regardless of living conditions.
Right.
Plus, there's often a mismatch between assets like owning a pucka house and actual capabilities. If there isn't enough investment in quality education, vocational training, skill development, people might not have the skills needed for higher paying, formal jobs, even if they live in a better house. There's a gap between the physical asset and the earning potential.
And what about basic services? Water, sanitation, health? Do they factor in?
Critically, underperforming or just plain inadequate civic services are a massive issue. Unreliable water, poor sanitation, not enough healthcare facilities. These directly hit people's health, their productivity, their overall economic situation.
Makes sense.
If someone's always sick from bad water or hours are lost fetching water, their ability to work consistently is hammered. So even in a permanent house, if basic services are missing, the path to economic stability is severely undermined. And finally, the way urbanization often happens rapid, sometimes unplanned, can actually intensify inequality. Economic growth tends to concentrate, bypassing low-income groups despite superficial improvements like housing. The benefits just don't trickle down effectively.
This deep dive really shows that solving urban poverty isn't just about building houses, is it? It's about connecting people to opportunities, stable jobs, essential services, making sure policies actually match the reality on the ground. What's the core insight for our audience here? And what are some forward-looking policy recommendations from the sources?
Yeah, the core insight is definitely that urban poverty is fundamentally multidimensional. It needs multifaceted solutions way beyond just housing. The recommendations are pretty comprehensive, advocating for a kind of think globally, act locally approach.
Yeah.
Meaning combining inclusive policies at the national, state, city levels, but crucially, targeting the specific needs of slums locally with a bottom-up approach involving the community. Big issues like land tenure security, giving people legal rights to the land they live on, and the broader right to the city need tackling at a higher policy level.
Okay.
Then, at the city level, local bodies need to create specific urban poverty alleviation plans, fully integrated into their main city master plans. And these plans must cover all settlements, notified slums, non-notified ones, underserviced areas that often fall through the cracks. Localizing goals like the SDGs in government missions is vital, shifting focus to outcomes on the ground, things like tenure security, basic services, genuinely affordable shelter, skill upgrades, entrepreneurship support, stable employment, community empowerment, and perhaps most critically, the sources strongly push for a comprehensive health and accident insurance package for the entire urban core population. Recognizing how crucial health security is to stop families falling deeper into poverty because of medical bills. It's this integrated approach, macro policy, micro realities, that's essential for inclusive, sustainable cities.
Okay, let's shift gears now, moving away from the bustling cities into the vast, often overlooked, rural landscapes of India. When we talk about India's economy and ecology, there's one group that often gets completely missed, yet our sources reveal them as vibrant, incredibly resilient, and profoundly vital. The pastoralists.
The herders.
Exactly. We're talking maybe 10 million pastoralists across over 50 distinct communities found in nearly every state, Himalayas, arid west, semi-arid Deccan Plateau. Their scale and contribution are just immense, frankly astounding.
You're absolutely right. These communities are the quiet backbone of a huge part of India's livestock economy. They manage almost all of India's sheep, around 75 million, making India number 2 globally.
75 million sheep.
Yeah. They manage nearly all the camels, too, and close to half the country's goats, about 150 million, the largest goat population in the world, plus about 10% of India's massive cattle population.
Wow.
And what's even more impressive and often totally unrecognized is their expertise as animal breeders. They are responsible for maintaining over 40% of India's incredible domesticated animal diversity, adapting breeds to incredibly diverse and often harsh conditions.
That's a huge contribution. So beyond the sheer number of animals, what's their actual economic significance and their sort of less obvious but equally crucial role in the ecosystem?
Well, their economic significance is profound and, as you said, often underestimated. They contribute directly and significantly to India's meat, dairy, dung, which is vital fertilizer and fuel in rural areas, wool, and leather economies.
Right.
Beyond those direct products, they're absolutely crucial for India's food security, providing a steady supply of protein and other animal products. They maintain this invaluable animal gene pool, preserving traits that might be critical for future climate adaptation or disease resistance. And perhaps most subtly, they contribute directly to the health of the very ecosystems they graze. Their traditional knowledge, their practices, are integral to the ecological balance and resilience of these vast rangelands. They're not just herders, they're land managers, biodiversity custodians.
But here's the twist, right? Despite this critical role, this resilience, our sources point out that pastoralists have faced, well, centuries of state opposition, and today they continue to face immense pressure. Why is that? And what are the specific challenges they face now in accessing vital resources, like forage for their animals?
It's a complex history, really, rooted in a deep misunderstanding of their practices, often shaped by colonial-era policies. A primary escalating challenge today is absolutely the shrinking access to forage lands.
How so?
Well, common grazing lands, village commons, they're increasingly encroached upon, converted for agriculture. That directly shrinks the land available. Similarly, the widespread use of groundwater across India allows farming to shift from single crops to multiple crops a year.
Right.
This reduces agricultural fallows, the land left uncultivated after harvest, which were historically crucial for pastoralists. They used them to pen animals, enriching the soil, and for grazing after harvest. That opportunity is disappearing.
And what about other land types? Those often called degraded or wastelands, are they also being lost?
Exactly. Lands often misleadingly labeled degraded or wastelands, which are typically open ecosystems like grasslands, scrublands, they're routinely diverted for industry, or for large-scale monoculture plantations, often justified as improving productivity. This narrative completely misrepresents the inherent ecological value and productivity of these lands for grazing. But the biggest challenge highlighted in our sources comes from what's called fortress conservation.
Fortress conservation.
Yeah, this aggressive approach to wildlife conservation across India has led to grazing bans and outright evictions of pastoralists from protected areas like national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. This has huge social and ecological impacts, even though there's a growing body of science questioning if there's even direct proof linking traditional pastoral grazing to land degradation. Some studies even argue well-managed grazing can benefit these ecosystems.
Right.
And even India's ambitious plan to plant 26 million hectares for carbon sequestration, largely targeting these same open ecosystems, could further deny pastoralists access, threatening the very future of pastoralism and the unique animal breeds they maintain.
Zooming out a bit, what does this imply? It sounds like a fundamental issue. Is how these landscapes were historically classified and seen. A classic case of misperception with long-term consequences, maybe. How did this misunderstanding even come about?
You've hit a critical point there. It largely stems from colonial influence and a very Western-centric view of land management. Foresters, often trained in European practices from, densely wooded, cooler climates, were primarily focused on timber as revenue.
Right, timber.
So they tended to classify almost any ecosystem with some tree cover as some kind of forest. This led to vast, sparsely treed landscapes in semi-arid regions being mislabeled as dry thorn or scrub forests. They were then mistakenly seen as degraded by things like grazing, implying they should be densely wooded rather than being recognized as naturally open, adapted ecosystems.
So they were judging these huge open ecosystems against a completely different inappropriate standard, trying to fit them into a European forest box.
Precisely. On the other hand, the really arid, grassy landscapes in Western India, they were correctly identified as naturally treeless, but from a purely timber or intensive farming viewpoint, they were just dismissed as unproductive wastelands.
Useless, basically.
Yeah, the view was they were only suitable for conversion to farming or industry. What was completely missing was the idea that these open ecosystems were fundamentally different from dense forests. Their real productivity needed looking at on large scales, focusing on the abundant grazers they supported, the unique ecological services they provided, not just the sparse plants on the ground. This profound misclassification, rooted in a narrow economic lens, led to centuries of policies opposing pastoralism, seeing it as destructive, instead of recognizing its ecological value and integral role.
This really challenges that common assumption, doesn't it? That lots of herbivores like cattle or sheep automatically make climate change impacts worse on grasslands. It sounds like pastoralism could actually be an ecological asset, not a liability.
It absolutely can be, and this is where the science is really shifting. The old wisdom assumes herbivores worsen climate impacts, leading to policies like grazing bans. But our sources, citing prominent ecological studies, argue these bans can actually be counterproductive.
How so?
Rangelands are naturally structured and maintained by herbivores, along with things like rainfall and soil. More importantly, research indicates herbivores often mitigate, not worsen, climate change effects on grassland vegetation.
Interesting.
This implies a growing appreciation for win-win strategies that explicitly include pastoralists as key stakeholders. These strategies can simultaneously provide multiple ecosystem services: food, water, biodiversity conservation, even carbon sequestration. It's a fundamental paradigm shift from seeing pastoralists as a problem to seeing them as part of the ecological solution.
That's a crucial shift, vital for India's environmental and economic future. But given all these challenges and misunderstandings, what's actually happening to these communities now? Is their traditional way of life changing, and what are the implications?
Unfortunately, yes. The trend of pastoralist sedentarization settling down, becoming less mobile, often forced by shrinking access to roots and grazing lands, it's accelerating rapidly.
The impact.
Significant, far-reaching implications. It directly hits the financial security and traditional livelihoods of pastoral households as nomadic life becomes less viable. It affects regional economies that lose the diverse products and services these mobile communities provide, from specialized animal products to natural fertilization of fields. And maybe most critically for the nation, it threatens the genetic diversity of India's domesticated livestock.
Oh.
Because pastoralists are expert breeders who've maintained unique, resilient breeds adapted to diverse, harsh conditions. Their settling down leads to a tragic loss of this invaluable genetic resource, a resource absolutely critical for future climate adaptation, food security, and the very future of India's livestock economy.
So what's the crucial takeaway here for our listener? This deep dive suggests that recognizing and actively supporting pastoralism isn't just about preserving culture. It's about the future of India's land, its economy, its ecological resilience. What urgent policy needs are highlighted to secure a sustainable future for them?
The sources propose several urgent foundational policy steps. First, just basic enumeration. Pastoralists and their livestock must be properly counted in the next livestock census. This basic data is missing, making effective policy incredibly difficult, like navigating without a map.
Right.
Second, we need inclusive, ecologically sound definitions of open, natural ecosystems, explicitly recognizing them as valuable rangelands, grasslands, not just dismissing them as wastelands, acknowledging their true ecological and economic roles.
And beyond just recognition and counting, how can their livelihoods be directly supported?
We need strategic public investments in livelihoods tied to milk and wool production, things pastoral communities often have in surplus with significant market potential. This needs coupling with better, accessible veterinary services for their livestock, often hard for mobile groups to get.
Makes sense.
And critically, survival hinges on continued, guaranteed access to forage. That means ensuring access to wastelands managed by the Revenue Department, and crucially, traditional grasslands and forest lands managed by the Forest Department. It requires a shift from exclusion to collaboration. Finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, India needs to formally legitimize these pastoral ecological systems, acknowledge their crucial value for health, food security, environmental sustainability, rather than seeing them as archaic, problematic, or a hindrance to modern development. It's about recognizing them as part of the solution, not the problem.
Okay, now let's shift our gaze dramatically to the world of global trade, which continues to shape economies and geopolitics everywhere. Our sources highlight this strong, accelerating global trend towards deeper economic integration. We're talking over 350 regional trade agreements currently in force worldwide.
That many. Wow.
Oh, yeah. We're seeing these big, comprehensive deals like RCEP, that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia-Pacific.
Yeah.
There's CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Deal, and the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, a newer initiative. It's clear economies are constantly looking for ways to integrate, strengthen their positions globally.
And what's truly fascinating here is why our sources zoom in specifically on South Asia and Southeast Asia as a critical region for deeper integration. Because together, these two regions represent an absolutely massive bloc.
How massive?
We're talking 32% of the world's population, a huge chunk of the global south, which itself is 70% of world population, 32% of global GDP. This isn't just numbers, it's immense human potential, a massive growing consumer base.
That's a significant demographic and economic powerhouse. But what makes these two regions, South Asia and Southeast Asia, a natural fit beyond just size? What are the shared threads?
Well, they share numerous deep commonalities, creating a strong, often overlooked foundation. There's a shared history of colonization, often leaving similar institutional structures, economic challenges. Striking similarities in social structures, long-standing cultural exchanges, intertwined values, linguistic connections across borders,
Right.
and crucially, geography, their neighbors.
Hmm.
But despite these deep links and their shared economic vulnerability to global giants like the US, China, the EU, current trade within the region is strikingly low.
How low?
For South Asia, it's only about 5% of its total trade. Southeast Asia is better, around 25%. But still, huge untapped potential. The World Bank in 2022 estimated South Asia's export potential just to Southeast Asia at $200 billion a year. Current exports, only $50 billion.
It's a big gap.
Huge gap. Deeper integration here isn't just about boosting trade volume. It's about creating needed structural shifts, giving a new lease of life to strained sectors like services or relatively inefficient primary sectors, by creating new efficiencies in markets.
This raises an important question, though. If the potential is so great, why hasn't it happened already? Or why have past studies often been pessimistic? Our sources seem to tackle this head-on with a new approach, right?
Precisely. Previous studies often offer quite pessimistic views or were limited by their methods. Some used simpler models that didn't capture the full dynamics of developing economies. Others, while more optimistic, relied on standard assumptions like full employment, which in regions like these with lots of underemployment and wage issues can overlook real-world complexities and potential gains from boosting employment.
Okay.
Our sources, however, advanced the methodology using computable general equilibrium CGE modeling, specifically the GTEP-10 database from 2014.
GGT.
Yeah, for our listener, think of the GTEP-TAP database as a massive, detailed snapshot of the global economy, trade flows, production, consumption across countries and sectors. It's a standard tool economists use to simulate policy changes. And crucially, they use an unemployment closure model.
What does that mean, practically?
It's important because it acknowledges that wages might not adjust instantly, meaning trade liberalization can actually increase employment in the medium run, not just shuffle existing labor around. This makes the analysis much more realistic and relevant for these regions where unemployment is a big factor.
It's a key methodological improvement. Paints a more nuanced picture. So how did they actually simulate deeper integration using this model? What were the different scenarios they looked at?
Right. They set up two distinct scenarios to model different levels of ambition. A limited scenario and a more ambitious scenario.
Okay.
In the limited one, they assumed a 50% cut in tariffs on primary goods like grains, meat, recognizing some agricultural sectors might be sensitive. For manufactured goods, textiles, light, heavy manufacturing, they simulated a full 100% tariff cut, assuming more competitiveness there. Additionally, they factored in a 25% reduction in non-tariff barriers, things like complex customs rules, licenses, differing product standards that block trade. And finally, a 10% cut in shipping costs within the region, reflecting maybe incremental improvements in logistics. This limited scenario reflects a cautious, step-by-step approach governments might take.
And the ambitious scenario, what did that involve?
That envision a much bolder integration. Zero tariffs on all imports across all sectors, a full free trade agreement, basically.
Wow.
Non-tariff barriers saw a bigger cut, down by 50% from baseline, acknowledging significant progress is possible through harmonized rules and streamlined processes, even if complete elimination isn't realistic. And a substantial 25% reduction in shipping costs within the region. This reflects the potential for major upgrades in shipping tech, cross-border infrastructure, logistics, things that could dramatically cut the cost and time of moving goods. These two scenarios let them explore the full range, from measured steps to a big push, showing policymakers the potential returns.
The results of these simulations are really the core here. What were the key findings? The welfare gains, the broader economic shifts for South Asia and Southeast Asia.
The findings are overwhelmingly positive, highly encouraging, especially on welfare gains measured as equivalent variation, basically how much richer people become. For South Asia, the limited scenario showed gains of nearly $87 billion. That translates to a solid 2.96% rise in real GDP for the whole region.
Significant.
Very significant. Under the ambitious scenario, gains nearly doubled, over $177 billion. That's a truly massive 5.97% rise in real GDP.
Almost 6%.
Almost 6%. Southeast Asia also saw substantial gains, over $63 billion limited, over $130 billion ambitious, leading to real GDP rises of 1.66% and 3.36% respectively. These aren't minor shifts. They represent profound economic benefits for millions.
That's huge for the integrating regions. What about the rest of the world? Does this mean trade diversion, losses for others like the U.S. or China?
Yes, to some extent it does. Other major trading partners, China, U.S., EU did register small but noticeable losses in real GDP. As trade naturally gets diverted towards the newly integrated SACA region, for instance, in the ambitious scenario, the U.S. might see a real GDP loss of 0.15 percentage points. Small percentages, maybe, but applied to those huge economies, it represents notable shifts in trade flows away from traditional partners as the new regional bloc gets more competitive.
And when you break down those welfare gains, what was the single biggest driver? How are these gains achieved?
Yeah, the welfare decomposition is fascinating. It tells us how the gains happen. The endowment effect was by far the biggest contributor for both regions.
Endowment effect.
In this context, it basically means a more intensive and efficient use of their existing resources, land, labor, natural resources. It suggests integration helps these regions unlock existing untapped productive potential, making the whole economy more efficient. It's not just shuffling resources around, it's actual growth from using what they have better, consistent with some core economic principles, actually.
So, better use of what they already have. Fantastic. But what about trade balances in terms of trade? Did they end up exporting more or importing more? And what about the prices they got for exports versus imports?
This is complex, but ultimately positive. Interestingly, both regions showed negative shifts in their trade balances, meaning they might import more than they export in the new setup. South Asia's balance shifted negatively by over $26 billion, limited. Over $53 billion, ambitious.
Okay, so importing more.
But UT, and this is crucial, they saw significant positive changes in their terms of trade. South Asia saw a 1.71% improvement, limited, 3.84%, ambitious. Southeast Asia, 1.56% and 3.32%. This means even if they import more, they're getting better prices for their exports relative to imports, better competitiveness, stronger bargaining power, they're getting more value for what they sell.
That's a complex but ultimately beneficial dynamic. Let's dig into the output changes because that tells us about structural shifts within the economies, which is vital for long-term development. What happened to different sectors?
Right. This is where we see really important transformations. In South Asia, the simulations showed a fall in production for sectors like extraction, mining, etc., processed food, and textiles apparel.
A fall. That sounds bad.
Not necessarily. It's part of a rebalancing. Crucially, the region gained tremendously in services, utilities, construction, communication, transport, and also saw big increases in light and heavy manufacturing. This indicates a clear, beneficial structural shift. Resources moving towards more productive, higher value sectors, a hallmark of development moving up the value chain.
And for Southeast Asia, similar shifts or differences?
Southeast Asia generally saw production increases across extraction, processed food, manufacturing. But there's an interesting contrast in one area: meat and livestock. While South Asia saw a rise here, Southeast Asia saw a significant fall.
Interesting trade-off.
Yeah, one of the few sectors where one region's gain was clearly the other's loss, showing evolving comparative advantages. The findings also suggest South Asia has a lower revealed comparative advantage, RCA, in food grains compared to ASEAN nations, meaning ASEAN is relatively better at producing food grains. Explains some shifts. South Asia might import more food grains while specializing elsewhere. But the increased manufacturing output in South Asia is key, ensuring that vital sector finds sound grounds for growth and resilience.
So what's the crucial takeaway for our listener from this segment? These simulations offer a powerful beacon for policymakers, businesses, pointing towards deeper, highly beneficial regional integration. What are the key policy implications?
Well, the first major one is the vital need to strengthen manufacturing in South Asia. India's seen service sector growth, but manufacturing has been relatively stagnant. These simulations clearly show a robust, competitive manufacturing sector is essential for real economic expansion, reducing dependence on places like China for goods, building a resilient industrial base. It's strategic, not just economic numbers.
And what about agriculture, still so central to South Asia?
The findings suggest a structural shift from agriculture to manufacturing is not only inevitable, but also necessary for a healthier, more advanced economy. Doesn't mean less farm output overall, but increased output per person, higher labor productivity, maybe better returns for those remaining in farming as resources optimize.
Right.
But crucially, the simulations also emphatically stress that the big gains from cutting tariffs and non-tariff barriers. They're marginal, they won't be fully realized, without major improvements in shipping tech, cross-border connectivity, physical infrastructure, railways, roads, modern ports. Regional governments must commit substantially to streamlining cross-border transport, investing heavily in logistics, building the physical arteries for trade to flow efficiently. Without that foundation, the full transformative potential just can't happen. Hashtag outro. So if we connect all these threads, to the bigger picture, what we've deep dived into today really underscores the intricate interconnectedness of all these policy areas that often seem separate, from making sure funds actually reach the people who need them most to really rethinking how we support urban populations, recognizing the deep ecological wisdom of pastoral communities, and then harnessing the huge power of regional trade. It's all part of this larger, incredibly complex story of development.
Absolutely.
It shows how challenges in one area ripple through others, and how thoughtful, integrated, genuinely implemented policies are the real key to unlocking a nation's full potential.
That's right. Each piece of this puzzle, from the frustrating realities of underused funds to the surprising benefits of deep trade integration, offers crucial, often non-obvious insights. For you, the learner, these aren't just facts. They're invitations to consider the why behind the headlines and the potential for real, impactful change. It's about understanding those intricate nuances, economic, social, ecological forces interacting on the ground, shaping millions of lives.
And it highlights that genuine progress isn't always just about scaling up old models or chasing GDP growth at all costs, is it? Sometimes it's about looking at what's overlooked or profoundly misunderstood, like the ecological wisdom of pastoralists or the multifaceted reality of urban poverty that goes way beyond just income figures.
Right.
It's often in these neglected areas that truly innovative, equitable solutions might actually lie, unlocking even greater potential.
So here's a provocative thought for you to mull over. As India continues its phenomenal journey of development of global integration, how might these diverse insights about local challenges, overlooked communities, strategic global connections, how might they fundamentally reshape the way we define progress and equity? Is it just about hitting economic milestones? Or is it about truly uplifting every community, fostering genuinely sustainable interactions with the environment, and making sure growth benefits everyone, not just a select few? What does progress truly mean when you look through these different lenses?
Indeed. Think about how nurturing overlooked traditional economies like pastoralism, or truly getting a handle on the multifaceted nature of urban poverty, could unlock even greater potential than just focusing on large-scale economic indicators alone. The future of development really lies, I think, in synthesizing these often separated domains: people, policy, and planet, all intricately intertwined.
A lot to think about as always. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.